Indie Author Lab from the Alliance of Independent Authors is a brand new in-person event for indie authors during London Book Fair Week. Taking place in London on March 11, 2026, it's a full day of mentoring, workshops, and community connection. Created for indie authors by indie authors. Learn more and secure your tickets at selfpublishingadvice.org/indieauthorlab. Welcome to Self-Publishing with ALLi from the Alliance of Independent Authors. This week, it's our advice stream focusing on editing and design. Discover how you can apply best practices in these first stages of the publishing process to ensure the excellence of your work and its ability to appeal to your target readership. And here's your host for the Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast, ALLi Campaigns Manager, Matty Dalrymple.
Hello, everyone. I am Matty Dalrymple, and I am here today with Brenna Bailey-Davies. Hey, Brenna, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me here.
I am thrilled to have you here and to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you. Brenna Bailey-Davies is an editor and writer based in Mohkinstsis or Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Through her company, Bookmart Editorial, she specializes in editing science fiction and fantasy and romance for indie authors and traditional publishers, focusing on stories with queer representation. She has 5 sapphic contemporary romance novels under the pen name Brenna Bailey. And Bookmart Editorial is a proud partner member of ALLi, so we always enjoy hearing from our partner members. And I invited Brenna on the podcast to talk about from both sides of the page, from editor to author and back again. And I always think this is so interesting to hear about people who are seeing the process from both sides of the pen, so to speak. So just tell us a little bit. Did you start out as an author and become an editor? Start out as an editor and become an author? What was your progression there, and why did you make the switch?
So I started out as an editor. I mean, okay, technically, if we're going way back, I started as an author because I wrote books when I was like in elementary school. And even before that, I was writing little stories. But professionally speaking, I started as an editor first. I was working for indie authors, like as a freelancer. And then there was like kind of a point in high school where I stopped writing because I thought that I wasn't creative for some reason. This was an idea that I got in my head. But as I was editing books and, working on indie author stories, I found them really inspiring, and I kind of felt that itch to start writing my own stories again. And my spouse was like, "You are creative." And he was really encouraging me to see myself that way. So I just kind of jumped in and gave it a go. And then, got into publishing from there.
So do you think that there was anything beyond the fact that your spouse kindly gave you that the impetus maybe you needed? Were there other things that made you revisit that idea that you weren't a creative person?
Yeah, I think because I was working with indie authors, I was listening to a lot of self-publishing podcasts, like the ALLi podcast and Joanna Penn and Mark Leslie Lefebvre. And I think that I had already realized that I was creative. It just took someone pushing me over that line for me to take that leap. But I think it was kind of percolating in the back of my head that this was something that I wanted to do, that it was a business and a creative mindset that I found really attractive, to write your own book and put it out in the world.
So how did the experience of approaching creative work as an editor and an author, how did those two experiences differ from each other?
They differ a lot. You kind of have to flick a switch a little bit in your head when you switch from one to the other, because when you are editing, you're looking at someone else's work. And so you don't have all of that kind of behind the scenes information, right, that goes into it. And so the creativity that you bring to editing is more as an outside observer thinking, how can I improve this based on the author's vision? Whereas, as an author, it's my heart and soul being put into the book and my really intimate viewpoint, and I can't step out of it and be that objective observer. So I feel like a lot more involvement on that level for me when I'm doing author work, like when I'm writing, rather than when I'm working on someone else's work.
Yeah, I would think it would be difficult. Like, I find that there are certain kinds of books that I can't read when I'm writing certain kinds of fiction. So if I'm writing in my thriller series, I kind of can't be reading thrillers because there's this danger that, if I happen to be reading Mick Herron, then suddenly my books are going to start, sounding like a cheesy of a McCarran or whatever that might be. How have you found that? Like, is the experience of being immersed in the creative voice of your clients, does that make it more or less difficult to develop your own creative voice?
I think it helps for me. I get kind of inspiration from seeing what other people are doing. It's the same way that I would take inspiration from reading books, except, I have to kind of still have my professional hat on when I'm editing rather than when I'm reading books. That's just for fun. But something that I did notice along this line, it's not so much genres that I can't read, but I've had to take a step back from developmental editing because I find that my brain is so full of kind of the big picture elements of my own work that I can't expend that type of energy on client work as well. So I've had to kind of focus on copy editing and proofreading and consulting for my client work so that I can focus on the big picture developmental editing when I'm drafting for myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that conversation sort of highlights for me that, I think that a lot of authors think of editing as just editing, like you go to an editor and then you get an editorial input. But I think that the skill sets are very different. Like not only the skill sets, but what people want to do, like their considerations that you're describing where your own creative work sort of steers you toward one and not the other. And that people shouldn't necessarily be looking to one person for all the sort of editorial input they may be looking for.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
So one of the things that we had talked about as a topic of conversation was the idea of balancing creative and client work. We've talked a little bit about like how you do that kind of from a mindset point of view, but what are some of the other things you factor in when you're trying to decide how to balance a client's work and your own?
Well, first of all, let me say I have not quite found the perfect balance yet. I think that's a bit of a work in progress, but something that I've had to accept is that it's never going to be a 50-50 balance. There are times when, my editing business takes precedence, and there are times when the author business takes precedence, and it just kind of depends what's going on in my life or in my businesses that determine that. So, and I have to be okay with that, right? Like there are some times where I feel like my author business is kind of falling to the wayside, but that is okay because sometimes I need to rely on the finances for my editing business. So I might need to work on it more. Whereas if I'm doing like a launch is coming up or I'm running a Kickstarter or something for my author business, well, obviously that's going to take more energy and time and effort. So yeah, just kind of accepting that there's more of a flow than a 50-50 balance has helped. And also like thinking about my own circadian rhythms and when I'm most creative during the day, and then setting boundaries to make sure that when I need time for my own creative work, I can get it. So if I'm like, I'm not a write every day kind of writer. I'm like a project writer. So I'll work in batches. And if I know that I need to draft something, usually what I'll do is I'll do the editing work that I need to get done in the morning, and then I'll do the drafting like after dinner. And I have to say to my spouse and my friends, like, listen, this month I'm drafting a book, so I can't actually do anything in the evening. Like I am not free this month. This month is my writing time, and I set that aside. And all of the people in my life are very gracious and they're okay with that.
Well, I think you're saying something very important that even people who are doing all their own work can tap into that. Like there are definitely at times of the day, as you're referencing, that I am better at creating content. And then other times of the day, I'm better at editing content. Like I'd rather be sitting around in the evening editing than I just can't imagine sitting around in the evening and drafting stuff fresh. So people can apply that even if they're not an editor, if they're just editing their own work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it brings up an interesting idea that in terms of the timeframes authors should be thinking about when they're booking time with an editor. So I think that if people have insight into how editors are managing their own time, like, do you have a sense a week ahead, a month ahead, a quarter ahead, whatever, about what your availability is going to be for client work as opposed to your own work?
Yeah, so generally I'm booked out for editing usually a couple of months ahead. So that's useful for clients to know. But also, like I said, with, putting aside my own time to draft, if I know that I have a big project coming up from the author perspective, I will also book off more time for myself. So then that means that and I'm not available till even later for editing. So I think it's part of the business mindset, like thinking of both things as a business, like editing is a business, but being an author is also a business. And so I have to be willing to dedicate the necessary time to keeping that business running, right?
Yeah. I think that's a real challenge. And again, generalizable beyond people who are editing, of that idea of thinking of it as a business and where do you invest your time, depending on your other circumstances. Like maybe you have more flexibility if you're in a day job and you're not relying on your creative work to pay the bills, but that's different if you are relying on your creative work to pay the bills.
Yeah, for sure.
So are there business lessons that you've taken from your editing job that you apply to your job as an author as well?
Oh, 100%. I feel like I actually got a bit of a step up because I was editing first. So I was used to working at home, setting my own schedule, being my own project manager, like marketing for myself, making a network so that I could get jobs, things like that. And all of that stuff has kind of applied to being an author as well. Because when you're an author and you're running your own business, again, unless you hire people to do things for you, you are wearing all of those hats. So I think I was already prepared to do that. And because I was already fairly established in the editing community, I had connections that helped me in my author business. So like, I'm friends with a lot of editors. That helps a lot when I need an editor. So I think it helped prepare me for that business mindset. It helped me go into it knowing this isn't like a get rich quick scheme. This is something that I'm doing because it's a passion project, but also because it's a business that I'm hoping will make me some kind of income in the long run.
Yeah. I'm now curious about an editor knowing editors. Like I always think that if you go into a beauty salon, you shouldn't go to the hairdresser who has the best hair. You should find out who cuts that person's hair. Like, there's sort of a one remove there. I'm really interested in what you as an editor look for when you're vetting editors for your own work.
So I look for people who I know are interested in what I'm writing, because that's really important to me. I want to make a connection with an editor. So yeah, people who work in kind of my niche or my genre. I look for people who I know kind of what their working background is. I know that they're trained. I know that they keep up with professional development. I know other books that they've worked on that I've enjoyed. Also, something that has factored in a lot for me is skill swaps. So, and authors can take a lot from this as well. Like, you don't have to pay everyone in money necessarily, right? So because I'm an editor who writes and I know other editors who write as well, I can swap with them. So I can edit their work and they can edit mine. And that works out really well for both of us.
Yeah, I can see all sorts of opportunities for people who are like social media gurus, for example. That's always an in-demand skill. And if an author is out there and has social media skills and is looking for some barter opportunities, I think they could barter with that pretty easily.
Oh, definitely.
Are there any other business practices that you feel like you've taken from your editorial work that you've applied to your author work?
I think in terms of business processes, it's more just kind of like the overhead stuff. So, when I'm working on a client project, I have a Trello board that I have all the steps in so that I can move it from one to the other. And I do the same thing with my author work, right? I map out a publishing schedule and then I move the project from where it is from one to the other. So it's kind of like I'm managing my own projects in the same way I manage client projects, but I'm also the person writing them. So I think that helps a lot. And then just the keeping up with industry trends and like following what's happening in the industry. I started doing that when I was an editor for indie clients. And then as I'm an author, that has kept up. And because I already had all that knowledge, I could bring that with me into the process. And then also just general publishing things. Like I know what the process is in traditional publishing for, how you bring a book from the roughest of drafts to the polished final. And I wanted to follow that for my indie books as well, because I want them to be high quality. So I was able to take that knowledge and then kind of build that process for myself as an indie author.
What are some of the industry, either the types of news or the resources you're using? What are some examples of things that you found useful to stay on top of in that area?
Podcasts, a lot of podcasts. I mentioned some before, like ALLi, for example, and blogs. Joanna Penn's Creative Pen podcast, Mark Leslie Lefebvre's Stark Reflections podcast. Was it the Wish I'd Known Then? Is that what it's called?
Yes. Jamie Albright and Sarah Rosette. Wish I'd Known Then, yeah.
Yeah, so that also Jane Friedman, keeping up with Jane Friedman's work.
Yes.
She provides so much like news. She's on top of news and all the goodies you can get from Jane Friedman. So yeah, just kind of following things like that, or like signing up for like Draft to Digital newsletters or written word media, like all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I love that at least 3 of those people are ALLi advisors. Joanna Penn, Mark Lefebvre, and Jane Friedman are all ALLi advisors. So we're tapping into the right pool of experts to bring that expertise to our members. And those are all people that I myself follow and benefit from.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would also mention some of the business practices that you've learned in terms of editing traditionally published books. Or what are some of the lessons you've learned there that might be valuable for indie authors to be aware of?
So basically there, I'm thinking about the editing in particular, how many levels of editing the books go through before they get published. So, you get developmental edits, and then you get line and copy edits, and then you get a proofread, and then there's formatting. Well, often the formatting happens before proofreading, but like there's all of these steps, right? And the cover design and all of these things, writing your blurb. So I wanted to make sure that I could kind of replicate that process through my own networks.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to consider the formatting part separately, because I know that the software that I use, once I've carefully proofread it and then loaded it into my formatting software, I always page through. I always virtually page through it to make sure that it looks like I really expect it to look. And sometimes you find surprises that you wouldn't expect to see in there. So I like that idea of having the formatting be a separate level of assessment before you hit publish.
Well, and lots of authors, like most authors, when they say they need a proofread, they want it done on the manuscript before it's been formatted. But I think what a lot of people don't think about, and like you just said, like once you format it and then you're ready to publish, you can still miss things. Like there are headers in the wrong place, or page numbers are missing, or, spacing in a certain line went wonky or something like that. So that is really what proofreaders are for. They're there to catch typos, but they're also there to catch formatting errors. So going over it again as that final polish stage, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I have had the experience of, I'm always afraid that in making a change, like let's say I update my bio in a document in my formatting software, and then I'm always afraid that I've made some unintentional change. And I have done in the past. I've sort of identified a pool of people who are, in exchange for getting the book early, they're willing to give it a read. And I have had people do another proofread after I've made other changes, just to make sure I didn't make any changes that I didn't mean to.
In my very first book, I had one of my friends who I gave the book to after it was published. She pointed out a typo on my copyright page.
Yes.
And I was so upset.
Yeah, because you don't think to read the copyright page. It's just like, it almost feels like an image or something like that, something that requires editing. But yes, absolutely. I've used the approach of giving people a typo bounty. So this is my frugal tip to people, is that I'll give them a copy of the book and I'll say, I'll pay you $5 per typo, up to $50. And I always just give them $50 anyway. But it's an inexpensive way of getting a proofread.
Yeah, and that's so kind.
So we've talked a little bit about how you applied lessons from your editorial work to your authorial work. So how about the other way around? What kind of things, how do you feel like your editorial work has benefited from the fact that you are also an author yourself?
I think it's just given me a more holistic view of what publishing and writing looks like, because now I know exactly what authors are going through. I know how hard it is to sit your butt in a chair and write. I know how hard it is to finish a draft. I know the feelings involved in the whole process and how close you can get. And I mean, most editors know this theoretically, right? Like, yes, a work is an author's baby. They spend a lot of time and effort on it. But I think it's one thing to know that in theory, and then another thing to go through it yourself. So, when I'm coming at my editorial work now, I feel like maybe I have an increased sense of empathy for what the author went through in writing it. And I'm able to keep that in mind as I'm communicating and as I'm structuring my own services and processes for my editing business. So for example, like one of the services that I offer is called VIP Publishing Guidance. And that's specifically for authors who are nervous about going into publishing, or they're planning to self-publish, but they don't really know what they're doing. Or maybe they know the theory of it, but they want someone to walk them through it. So like that service is just 5 hours of time where I sit down with an author and I help them walk through all of those steps. Because even though I knew all of the stuff in theory before I published, it's still very different to sit down and have to, fill out a metadata page or like find keywords, like all of that stuff. You hit snags and then it stops you in your tracks and you're like, wait, I didn't think about that.
Yeah. Well, I would think that on top of the sort of mechanics of indie publishing, which you're referencing, and I don't know, like the coaching or like therapist role, I don't know quite what to call it, but I do feel like in some cases an editor can almost need to act like a therapist for their, when their author client is about to, go over the edge. And being able to come at that from the point of view of having had that experience yourself, I think is very valuable. What are your thoughts there? Like, to what extent do you as an editor feel like there's also this level of creative coach for your clients?
There's definitely, like, being an editor specifically for indie authors involves a ton of coaching. And a lot of it is explaining what things mean or what things are, because sometimes writers are coming into it with very little publishing experience. Well, like no publishing experience for a lot of them. But they won't know what certain terms mean, or they don't know how to structure something properly. And I can, from, working on my own book, I can say, okay, I got stuck in a similar spot. This is how I was able to get over that hurdle. Or I can have, multiple strategies to help them work through something, to work through like a sticking point with their characters, or to help flesh out some of the world building a little bit more. Like I just am more familiar with different strategies because I've had to try so many with my own work.
Yeah. Yeah. I also think that idea, you have like a pretty specific editorial focus. And I think that's so important, and important for authors to realize that what they want to find is an editor who has experience in their genre, because you understand the tropes, you understand the conventions, you understand the tips and tricks, you understand what should and should not be done. And I think the other thing that I didn't fully appreciate until many years ago, I sort of tried my hand at editing another author's work, is that having experience in the particular genre gives you the pool of examples to draw from. If you're trying to illustrate a point and you say, well, you probably want to hold off on sharing this bit of information in the same way that some other author, some very successful and well-respected author, holds off on a reveal or world building or whatever that might be. It's good to have that pool of examples that you can draw from.
Yeah. And it's honestly very satisfying when the example I can draw from is something from my own experience.
Yeah.
I read a lot, right? So I can draw from books that I've read from, but when I can say, oh, listen, this happened to me and this is what I did. It's satisfying.
Yeah, it's satisfying for you, and it's gratifying, I think, for the client, because they realize that you're in the trenches with them. You're not, kind of like working from your ivory tower. You're someone who has had these experiences as well, which I think can be very comforting to an author. You had talked a little bit about the fact that you have built up networks in both the writing and the editing worlds. Can you talk a little bit about other ways you've tapped into those networks and how you went about building them up?
Mm-hmm. So when I first built my editing networks, it was primarily online. Twitter was like the big hub at the time, the big publishing hub. And so I built a lot of my relationships with other editors on Twitter. And then, of course, Twitter became X and all of that stuff happened and people left. But when I became an author, I built most of that community online on Instagram. So I had a lot of online communities. And then, I don't know, something happened with social media. I think there's been a shift where I'm not getting as much traction as I used to. I've kind of moved away from it and taken a step back. But I've realized that the more in-person events I go to, or, specific Zoom events online or conferences, especially conferences, a lot of the people that I know are now going to those. And so I'm able to network that way. And there's so much overlap between events that editors and authors go to. And in a lot of ways, it's made networking, like it's taken the pressure off of networking for me, because no matter which way I'm going, whether I'm talking to editors or I'm talking to authors, I feel like I have a valuable additional perspective to provide. And I feel like I'm just coming from a place of my own experience rather than trying to sell myself, because I come from both worlds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being able to immerse yourself in a community, just as a member of a community and not as a salesperson, it's always more comfortable for everyone. It's more comfortable for the person who has something to offer, and also more comfortable for the people around them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, I think it's always dangerous to assume that one's own experience is the experience other people are having. And I've definitely myself am going through this phase of really backing off social media. And in fact, I just started posting on Substack like earlier this week. And it was one of those things that I'd held off on doing because I'm a big fan of like building on land you owned, and, put your content on your own website. But I was developing a presentation that involved publishing articles, and people always ask about Substack. And I thought, well, I should really have experience in it. And I'm having so much fun. It really feels like social media did years ago, when it really was social and not just like an advertising platform. So I feel like I'm hearing that from enough people that it's not just me. And I'm going to be curious to see where that goes with social media. Is it really a social platform? Or, as you're saying, are people kind of moving more to in-person events? I think they are.
Yeah, I think they are too. And that's good to hear, because I've also been considering moving to Substack.
Yeah, I'm having fun so far. I've only been on there for like a week, but so far so good. I mean, it does feel like people who have ideas as opposed to people who have memes. It's just feeling like a more productive and creatively fulfilling kind of place to be. So the final thing we wanted to talk about a little bit is navigating feedback from both sides of the page. And I think this is always interesting to hear from someone who does both editorial work and authorial work to get tips about how should an author be dealing with the kind of feedback that they're likely to get from an editor. Maybe vice versa. Maybe the type of feedback an editor might get from the author.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting topic for me as well, because I work for traditional publishers and indie authors. And the one packager, the traditional publishing packager that I work for, when I started working for them, they told me, do not put in reader comments. So, the kinds of things where you'd be like, oh, wow, that was like so surprising. Or I really love this line. Like, they told me not to do that because their reasoning was that career authors don't like that. But I thought that was a little weird because as an indie author, that's like my favorite part of editing, is seeing my editor's reader comments on how they related to the text or what they liked or what they found funny. Like, I think that's, it's a very human to human connection in the text. And I've seen the same kind of feedback from indie authors, because after I work with an author, I will send them a questionnaire like, what did you like about working with me? What could I have done better? That kind of thing. And almost every time they will say, oh, I loved these comments that you put in my manuscript. So even though, I respect my traditional publisher packager and I think that they're brilliant at what they do, but I would like to respectfully disagree about that comment thing, because I think that's really fun as an author to get those comments and as an editor to leave those comments.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I asked my editor to do. I said, like, if you laugh at something, can you just put an LOL in there so I know? Because I think that one of the things that addresses is that no editor in like their overall assessment of the book is going to say that line on page 27 was really funny. Like, it's just going to get lost, But I think that as an author, knowing that the reader reacted in that way in that moment, yeah, I totally agree. I think that those reader comments, as you're saying, are both very fun and vitally important for your craft development.
Yeah. And just knowing, that your editor is actually engaging with your work and is into it enough to have those reactions. That's, I think, comforting as an author to know that the editor isn't just a robot going through my work. They are an actual human being with emotions who is having reactions. Like, that is something that I want to know.
Yeah, I think especially when the progression of a reader's response is very important, as it is with like mysteries. Like, I love it if readers say, like, if an early reader is going through it and says, oh, at this point, I think so-and-so did it. Oh, it's 10 pages later. I think so-and-so did it. And that is so valuable. I mean, as you're saying, it's very fun and also just very valuable to understand if you've built up the red herrings or the suspects or the little twists the way you expect to.
Definitely. And then also too, just a note for, as an author reacting to criticism, it can be really difficult as well because not all the criticism is positive, right? A lot of the times it is something that your editor suggests that you change for one reason or other. And hopefully if they're a good editor, they're saying it in a nice way. But something that I always tell authors when they are receiving their manuscripts, first of all, take space. So, read over the report that your editor gives you, look through the comments, but don't work on it right away. Take some space to, get emotionally distant a little bit. So if something is like really, something made you throw your walls up, maybe just take a step back, gain a little bit of objectivity, and also ask yourself why that wall has gone up. Is it there because you really care about this particular thing in the story? Because it's really personal to you? Is it there because you think the editor is objectively wrong? I mean, objective is, there's not a ton of objectivity when it comes to storytelling, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, do you think the editor is wrong? Do you think that it's actually better for the story to leave it the way it was? Like, you have to be able to think through it without completely just reacting in the moment. So being able to take that space and then, come back with a little bit of a cool, clearer head is very useful for criticism.
Yeah, I've had the experience. I had my editor say that he felt that the fact that two characters had met before was unrealistic. And I realized that it wasn't that it was unrealistic. It was that I hadn't painted the scenario in a way that illustrated why it was realistic. Mm-hmm. It was a small community, a small island community. And so the people, in a certain strata of that community would run into each other. So it wasn't that I needed to remove the aspect of them recognizing each other. It was that I needed to set up more effectively so that familiarity they had was realistic. So yeah, thinking about one layer down behind what the editor is saying about your work.
Exactly. Like, even if you don't agree with what their exact comment is, their comment could be indicating that there's something else that needs to be adjusted.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. I think that that's a really good example of knowing how to capitalize on that relationship as an author to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. You're building a productive relationship with your editor.
Definitely. And I do think it's useful, as much as some people don't like doing video calls and they like just working over email. Sometimes a video call can be super helpful to talk things out because, the tone or, like you said, the layer underneath can get lost in writing. So sometimes if you're confused, being able to have the type of relationship with your editor where you can say, hey, can we have a video call because I'm a little bit confused about this? That is super helpful.
Yeah. And saying it as I'm a little confused about this, not because I want to get on the phone and yell at you.
Yes.
Something you didn't recognize about my brilliance. That's fun. Well, Brenna, we're nearing the end of our time, but are there any other thoughts you'd like to share? Any tips you'd like to share from the editorial point of view that you think would be of help to our listeners who are going to be mainly authors?
This is one that I've heard from other editors who are authors that I strongly disagree with. So I'm just going to put out my 2 cents. If you are an editor who is an author or an author who is interested in editing or who is good at editing, I strongly suggest not editing your own work. Without just editing your own work and then putting it out there. I really think it's so, so important to get someone else's eyes on your work. Because even as editors, you could be the best editor in the world, but your own work is going to have things in it that you can't see because you're so close to it. Even typos, right? Our brains are weird. They fill in the gaps. So you need someone else who has space from your work to go over it for you.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when it comes to like character motivation, that's what always strikes me. Like, I know my character so well. I know why they're doing something. And it's always useful to me to have someone else say, it's really not clear to me why that character did that. I can say, oh, yeah, I need to make that a little more explicit.
Yeah, exactly.
So cool. Well, Brenna, it has been such a lovely conversation to have with you. And I always enjoy hearing about people who have that experience on both the writing and the editing sides. And so please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and Bookmartin Editorial and everything you do online.
Well, thank you again for having me here. If you want to find my editing stuff, that's at bookmartineditorial.com. That's BOOKMARTEN editorial.com. And then my author stuff is at BrennaBailey.com. And there's links on each website to each other also.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to the editing and design stream of the Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast, and if you haven't already, we invite you to join our organization and become a self-publishing ally. You can do that at allianceindependentauthors.org.